Inspired by the Nottingham region's folklore of the 10 o'clock horses, a story told to children to encourage sleep before 10 at night, otherwise they would be stolen by nighttime creatures. This sculpture weaves together elements of the narrative with deeper reflections on childhood fears, imagination, and the unsettling blur between reality and dreams. The work evokes an atmosphere of dark woods, hidden traps, and labyrinth mazes, haunted by the disquieting image of horses. It captures the sensation of being trapped in a nightmarish landscape, unable to escape, unable to wake, and caught in the uncertainty of whether the experience is a dream or something more real. This painting is inspired by the Victor Eris film Spirit of the Beehive, 1973. It is an evocative, beautifully shot story of a 6 year old's innocence and naivety set in Castilla in 1940. Certainly, not a horror story, except the little girl, Anna, sees the film Frankenstein at a traveling cinema, triggering her imagination and misunderstanding. Too wonderful to describe here. The title is from the song Sleepwalker's Woman by Scott Walker, one of the most idiosyncratic and fascinating artists in music. Horror, for me, has always been defined by low budget movies. Although the Saw movies are now a high budget franchise, the first Saw is very reminiscent of those low budget horror staples. Handmade, grungy props, shaky cameras, the overall dingy feel is now an iconic part of the Saw franchise. Limitations inspire creativity, and I try to find that in the making of my mask. Using everyday materials, plastic pipes, cardboard, etc., to try and emulate things on screen and get that handmade feel to the first Saw film. The horror genre often gets a bad reputation for endorsing ugliness. Whilst I do not think beauty to be necessary or objective, Ari Aster's Midsummer discredits these stereotypes as it retains all its majesty and visual appeal, despite being one of the most psychologically harrowing horror films that I have personally ever watched. Florence Pugh does a fantastic job with the protagonist Danny, and so I felt compelled to paint her. These photographs are taken from a series illustrating the classic fairy tale, originally by the Brothers Grimm, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which has been told in many different ways. For this series, I manipulated the meanings of the characters' names and transformed them to represent a modern horror take. Andrea Hassler's visceral sculptures often deconstruct luxury items. For this exhibition, an Alexander McQueen leather pouch, transforming them into grotesque, visceral forms that evoke both desire and repulsion. Her work analyzes the emotional connection to consumerism by merging the seductive opulence of high end goods with the raw, unsettling imagery of body horror. By turning handbags, shoes, and other symbols of status into fleshy organic structures, Hassler explores the fragility of desire and the darker side of human consumption. The body horror elements confront viewers with themes of decay and mortality, making the familiar disturbingly alien. Through her art, Hassler invites the reflection on the physical and psychological costs of our consumerism, challenging our relationships with material possessions and the human body itself. We are grossed out by the human body, and it takes a certain kind of person to be a surgeon, possibly a happy psychopath, if you will. We need these happy psychopaths to help us all lead a healthy life and sort the problems we cannot face. This is PYE's Surgical Handbook from the 1950s. It's a guidebook for practicing doctors and nurses on procedures and how to perform them. I have always found medical illustrations and photos from this era, in time, quite skin crawling, and within this carving are just a few of the many that were in this book. Just a side note also, I used a scalpel to create these carvings and cut the pages away one by one. People have said to me in the past, while watching me carve on live stream, that it looks like I am operating on the book. A composite landscape of numerous personal recurring dreams, the work engages with the friction between overwhelming anxiety and desire present throughout them. Abject and the body horror has allowed me to freely explore the strange corners of where apathy, fear, and desire interface, and explore corporeality in all its terror and beauty. Atop the domestic staple of the dinner table, Scarlet presents us with the gluttony of the banquet. We are teased with a sense of edibility through its promiscuous oozing forms, a smorgasbord of delights unfit for human consumption. Our feelings of attraction and repulsion are feasted upon through its enticing overabundance. Materials fluctuate between layers from the intimacy of condoms, tights, and gelatin to waste matter of used food casings and food packets, flowing finally into the hardened and glistening glass and ceramic. Mounted layers verge from inner to outer worlds and journey from the grotesque body to the domestic terrestrial to the sublime ethereal. There is a sense of camp joy in the banquet's titillating, teasing, deceiving, subverted qualities, yet a total authenticity in the way forms have been presented as themselves, heated and fused, squeezed and set. Scarlet feeds us a notion of the body which moves past its gendered confines, celebrating the abject in ingestion and expulsion. The banquet begs for the attention of its viewers. It allows itself to exist in one part as horrific, jarring, hedonistic, yet its writhing forces hold an all encompassing capacity for pleasure. Jessie Edwards navigates the uncanny through abstraction of the organic form. By subverting the concept of interior and exterior, her work invokes a vague, unplaceable discomfort in the viewer. Meanwhile, the intricacy in their texture, organic form, and colour sustain a sense of intrigue, which draws the eye in further. Introspection articulates the experience of inhabiting a body and the contradictory relationship between the self and its vehicle. This work explores the uncanny feeling that arises from familiar parts of the body being removed from their usual context. In this case, using it in conjunction with an inanimate object to give it a lifelike quality. The piece confronts you with the discomfort of the dissected body, juxtaposed with the familiarity of an object from the home. This piece deals with my personal battle with body dysmorphia, as well as perceived violence and beauty. Our reactions to images, our brain labels as violent, where our mind fills in the gaps of what we are seeing and how it makes us feel. The unease a painting can give us when it tries to portray anatomical beauty, while including the squishy stuff inside us as part of that beauty. This piece is a part of a series of monotypes inspired by the Orphic gold tablets, a series of ancient Greek texts inscribed on a gold leaf found in Bacchic cult graves that describe and direct the dead in their passage to the underworld. The imagery within these texts relates to the worship of Dionysus, a god who embodies the thresholds of fear and ecstasy. For me, these paintings explore deep emotions and the unsettling side of being human, embodying the clown paradox, where joy and despair exist side by side. These works align with the notion of horror as more than just shock or gore. The first painting uses the decaying setting and body language to symbolize the burden of trauma, evoking empathy rather than revulsion. Similarly, the second painting challenges the viewer to interpret the exaggerated smile as either a mask of resilience or an embodiment of inner turmoil. A picture interrogating the impact of architecture, neighborhood, institutions on the relationship between the individuals and their society. No answer, just a question due to the abstraction in the center of the photography. Brian Shields is an artist whose works center on an exploration of the eeriness of the high romanticism movement. In his work, Shields navigates the intersection between curiosity and horror. He currently lives and works in North Eden, Cumbria. It's about the danger within ourselves. This series focuses on insomnia and sleep paralysis, when a tired mind projects disturbing images from the world of dreams into reality, and you become a puppet of your own fear and imagination. A thank you to Dr. Lionel Elliott, left on his desk after teaching human anatomy class. Left with a note, thank you for teaching us the insides. It appeared to be a normal apple until cut in half. Diagnosed with classical Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a connective tissue disorder causing hypermobile joints, fragile skin, and poor wound healing, my experience with my corporeal body encapsulates terror and isolation. Consequently, my work delves beneath the surface of my scars to expose a life where pain is a foregone conclusion. Ruminations on control, power, and pain, my practice examines the lack of control I have over my body and the grief of feeling misunderstood and coming to terms with living with a chronic incurable illness. Do I control my body, or does my condition? In this dissonance, I grapple with pain, with myself, as power is paramount, and to me, painting is inherently an exercise of control. Manipulations of flesh and form are a means of regaining that control. The antithesis of personification, flesh is denied empathy, objectified, and relegated to exist as mere forms, subjected, defenseless, and available to be melded, weaving between the vibrancy and dramatic chiaroscuro. The visceral contends the controlled as forms torn, splintered, and striated for ambiguous space at my behest. Paradoxically, the imposition of sheer callousness upon my flesh is to translatory and pathetic ends. My words and scars cannot begin to encapsulate the reality of my existence. I can explain my history, my story, and my pain until I am blue in the face, but it would be to no avail. The pain of feeling wholly misunderstood and completely isolated in my existence drives my production. Consequently, through the honest and vivid representation of my bodily experience, mentally and physically, I hope to make visible the voice of those silenced and suffering from chronic illnesses, providing a means to bridge the gulf of misunderstanding between the abled and the disabled. The rumination diptych considers the notion of rumination centered on control through undulating forms that rest within and without themselves, processing the cognitive dissonance of feeling both inherently broken and profoundly alone. Employing the visceral as a method rather than a comprehensive purpose shifts the intention and mentality behind manipulating forms in space. Extrapolating the biomorphic qualities of these constructions, the piece reflects the process of engaging in the layering process of painting, allowing materiality and automatic mechanisms of form delineation to guide negotiations towards speculative ends. attempting to capture the discomfort and confusion within a body, as well as an overfamiliarity with your skin as it ages. The grain of the photos shows the wear of the skin as it undergoes damage through life experiences and trauma. These portraits are a part of a series of works created as a response to the immense and unremitting circulation of photographs that depict horror and violence on social media platforms. We live in a time when one can barely witness mass atrocities and war crimes, and often by the victims themselves. The resulting composition positions the viewer face to face with the subject and creates a power between their eyes. The square alludes to the format of Instagram posts and reminds us of our privileged status as onlookers of the unimaginable horrors that flood our feed and provide us with our daily diet of horrors. These free collages aim to explore the traditional representation of female characters in horror films. Each can be divided into the theme of male violence, sexualization, and hysteria, respectively. Isolating the images from their films reveals a pattern in the ways their female characters are presented, as subjects of male violence and perversion, as eye candy, and or as damsels in distress. The horror films of the second half of the 20th century consistently cast white, young, slim, beautiful actresses and place their characters in positions of submission, fear, and uselessness. I believe that these films were ultimately made for the male viewer by virtue of their unlikely majority, if not all, male camera crews, directors, producers, and casting directors. Films are the products of the choices made by specific people in a certain time and culture, and as a result, the representation of women in film aligns with their position in society. The representation of women in film has certainly improved in certain ways since the turn of the century, as has the position of women in wider society in certain ways. But equally, it would be naive to assume that the history of misogyny in the horror genre, cinema, and society in general doesn't continue to impact their present incarnations. These paintings bring together themes of mortality, isolation, longing, melancholy, and loss, and sit somewhere in between the physical constraints of reality and in the anarchic realm of the subconscious. They draw from Gothic motifs, fairy tales, and archaic tropes to explore broader issues relating to the physical and subjective self within contemporary society. The works are derived from preliminary sculptural explorations, the process further distorting the boundaries between the real and the perceived. The resulting paintings are contemplations on the variability and fallibility of memory. In order to create these paintings, Ben simulated a crowd by making a series of tiny sculptures to convey the idea and feeling of an assembly without any attachment to an actual event. After researching the most effective ways to depict a common figure, 7 archetypes was designed, from which approximately 200 casts of the figures were made. Stripped of any intimate character, the figures serve the purpose of icons or avatars, truncated representations of a whole, into which it is easy to project a notion of the self. The dioramas were rendered in paint using a technique that appears photographic from a distance yet becomes more abstracted and painterly with proximity. Repetition, miniaturization, and fluctuations between representation and abstraction were used to activate links between the body, movement, and memory. They are paintings of crowds without any people. This painting is intended to embody the terrifying idea of being caught somewhere in time, or unable to break away from a psychological loop. This is a seemingly inescapable state that is actually experienced by some people to varying degrees. Paper sculpture has been spliced with photographic images to form the reference for this painting, which is utilized to distort the boundaries between the real and the perceived. The painting represents two people held in expanded time, a permanent rose. The dominant pigment used also shares the same name. The figures are intended to appear frozen within a quiet yet implacable state. This painting is a continuation of the bone arrangement series, which was inspired by the fluent, ambiguous forms of bones. To make these paintings, Ben generated a sculptural interpretation of an entire human skeleton. Each bone was formed in clay based on his research of antique anatomical drawings. In keeping with an interest in destroying his sculptures, he began to break some of the pieces as the work progressed. He also added some intrusive elements, such as sculptures merely influenced by the shapes of bones, but which could never assume a function. These impurities and injuries enter the compositions like cancer cells, obliterating the possibility of the pieces ever working together in a conventional sense. As the series progressed, less and less of the original skeleton was present, until all that was left were coral like forms. This painting is inspired by attempts of machine learning to reinterpret these sculptures and paintings. The algorithm has further distorted the bones, forming strange nodules and construction that is almost architectural. This doll, Wendy Torrance, is played by Shelley Duvall, is a combination of two of my beloved horror films, Coraline and The Shining. The reason I feel so drawn to Duvall's Wendy is in part due to her insane and retrospectively underappreciated acting. However, a big part of it is the onset abuse she received from Stanley Kubrick. Both exploited, Duvall and Wendy merge as one vessel of trauma transcending fiction. The act of turning her into a doll speaks to the commodification of female bodies, especially prevalent in horror. Although not her best known outfit, I love it for its 80s garishness and the primary colour coordination with the rest of the film. I endeavoured to create this doll in the summer of 2022, yet the dress was only completed in January 2025, making it a posthumous depiction of my favourite Scream Queen, Final Girl. The Wind Peels the Trees to Bone examines how society reduces marginalized bodies to a spectacle, forcing them into an unconscious performance. The work reflects the violence of patriarchal expectations and able bodied ideals, whilst the deliberate eye contact reverses the oppressive gaze. Oakley's digital collages utilize horror as a reflection on the manifestations of society's fears about minority groups. Fear of the dark is one of humanity's most ancient and natural instincts. Without the comfort of a nightlight, I would dance to it, twirling and leaping as if a jubilant display of revelry could banish it. My childhood home was steeped in religious art and black mould, an odd substitute for wallpaper, yet both became my earliest companions. I found solidarity with the angels, perfectly painted and entombed behind glass, though the barrier could not shield them from the encroaching decay of our rotting house any more than my clothes protected me. Neither cherubs nor children are meant to walk with open wounds, yet in the case of many foster youth such as myself, rot is the epitaph of our youth. Don Giovanni was the first opera I had the privilege of experiencing, a gift from my foster mum. I sat enraptured, caught in the thrall of its monstrous music, a tempestuous beast barely restrained by the conductor, whose baton seemed to lash at it for the safety of all. That night, its shadowy undercurrents wove threads of fear into my dreams, eclipsing the terror of any horror film I had ever seen. As I woke up, I knew I was in love. Medical textbooks and diagrams littered the shelves of my youth. I often would flip through and try to emulate the diagrams I found there. That meat of our matter was a source of fascination, not fear for me. On one memorable playdate, I learned that was not true for one of my dearest friends. Mortality and death were concepts I knew young, but the confused mourning I felt for my friend in that moment was greater than that which I felt for my father or mother. My mother often sang Mother Glasgow to me as a lullaby of sorts, but the fourth line, unconsciously she clips their little wings, carved itself into my mind with a haunting permanence. It is common to deify one's parents. I was no exception, but always wondered what kind of god or mother could snip the wings of such precious things without thought or malice. What scared me more than the question was that I knew the answer. This painting is about the inherent horror and euphoria of transness. Horror in general, and specifically body horror, often feels inherently queer. It goes the other way too, others seeing the things you do to make your body into a comfortable home and interpreting it as something horrific. I painted this in 2023 while I was recovering from my gender affirming surgery, and so this painting is intrinsically linked to that experience for me. It was also at the same time I was writing my MA dissertation on Frankenstein as a trans icon, thinking about taking apart and putting back together of bodies and the way we remake ourselves in our own image. This was made in 2023. It depicts a kind of anthropomorphic, rampant capitalism and a feeling of being trapped in the belly of this particular beast. I wanted to use horror imagery to portray a feeling revulsion at the way people become dehumanized by greed. There was a lot of talk about trickle-down economics around the time this was made. Maybe it was during Liz Truss's short-lived tenure. The inhale is a depiction of wealth being sucked upwards and the feeling of an inhale of air during a panic attack in the middle of a cost of living crisis. There's a feral aspect to the kids. I think this was the idea of these kids becoming hungry enough that they'll eventually eat the rich. The third of these artworks was made as a kind of catharsis during many struggles to pay rent and the sense of debt collectors being like circling wolves. These pieces represent the feeling of disconnect and not recognizing oneself in our own body after experiencing immense trauma. Here, the diorama artist explores an abandoned theme through a surgery, bathroom, library, and rooms.